Tonight, I want to tell you a story about a woman left for dead in the Arizona desert. A woman betrayed by her own blood, tortured for a patch of worthless dirt, and meant to disappear like a ghost in the dust. Her name was Ellie, but they made one mistake. They left her breathing, she ran. And out there, in the unforgiving wild, she found a man who didn't offer comfort, who didn't ask questions. He just gave her a place to let her hate grow. This is a story about pain, about survival, and about the kind of strength you only find when you've got nothing left to lose. If it hits you where you live, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you know. Now, let's get into it. The desert doesn't care if you're weak, but it always, always remembers the desperate. Ellie ran under a moon the color of a fresh wound. Her boots were shredded. Her lungs felt like they were full of broken glass. Every breath was a sob, a ragged, tearing gasp stolen from the back of her throat. Her hands. Her hands were wrapped in bloody rags, and she clutched a thin shawl around her shoulders that did nothing to stop the wind from slicing right through her. She'd been running for hours, maybe days. Time was a blur of pain and fear. Her hands throbbed with a white-hot agony. Every single fingertip was a raw, blistered ruin, seared by red-hot iron. She remembered the smell of her own cooking flesh. Just that morning she hadn't screamed. Not when the iron hissed against her skin. Not when the men who were supposed to be her family, held her down on the dirt floor of the root cellar. But now, with every step she took on the cracked earth, her body screamed the truth that her pride had tried to swallow. They wanted her name on a piece of paper. They wanted her to sign away the land. It wasn't much, just 40 acres of scrub brush, wind, and disappointment. But it was her father's land, and his father's before him. It was where her mother had planted rows of corn that never grew, and where they were both now buried under stones Ellie had carved with her own two hands. That land was hers in a way no deed could ever define, but the paper was all they cared about. So they brought out the branding irons from the forge. 10 times they asked her to sign. 10 times she said no. And for every no, they pressed the glowing metal to one of her fingertips. Still, she didn't sign. When the smoke finally cleared, and the air was thick with the stench of scorched skin, they locked her in the cellar, they chained her hands and ankles, and they left her in the dark. Tomorrow, her Uncle Warren had said, his voice slick with false pity, she'd be found dead, a tragic accident, and the land would pass to those who knew how to make a profit. But Ellie hadn't waited for the sun. She'd spent hours working a loose stone in the cellar wall, her ruined fingers screaming, until she'd scraped a hole big enough to crawl through. Now she ran, broken, burned and bleeding, but alive. She followed an old freight trail, a forgotten scar winding through the basin. No wagons used it anymore. The railroad had made it obsolete. Now only the buzzards watched over it. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled, a lonely, mournful sound. She didn't even flinch. No animal in this desert could be half as monstrous as the men she'd left behind. Then her body finally gave up. Her knees just buckled. She went down hard, face first into the grit and stone. She didn't even feel the impact. She didn't try to get up. Her wrapped, useless fingers twitched at her sides. She just let her eyes close. If this was the end, she was ready for it. She'd fought long enough. But it wasn't the end. It was something else entirely. Ray saw the vultures long before he reached the trail. He'd risen with the dawn, as he always did. The high desert was slow in the winter, but it never slept, and neither did Ray. He moved with it, his hand resting near the long knife on his belt, his eyes scanning the rocky slopes with a practice born from 1,000 lonely sunrises. The buzzards weren't circling a dead deer, not this close to the old trail, and not with that kind of patience. They were waiting for something to die. He followed them, his worn boots making no sound on the broken stone. He moved like a shadow, careful, silent. He found her near a sharp bend in the trail, half buried in dust, looking like a discarded bundle of hides. But then he saw it, the tiny, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. She was still breathing. He knelt beside her. His fingers, gentle but firm, brushed against the crude bandages on her hands. And then the smell hit him. Burned skin, old blood, and fear. a fear so thick he could almost taste it. He scanned the ground around her. No tracks but her own, desperate and stumbling. No one was chasing her, not anymore. He lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of grain and didn't stir. As he settled her weight against his chest, one of the bloody rags on her hand came loose, falling away into the dust. He glanced down, and his blood ran cold. It wasn't just a burn, it was a mark, a symbol, a tiny, perfectly rendered shape of a coiled snake eating its own tail, seared into the flesh of her thumb. He'd seen that brand before. He'd seen it once, years ago, on a man he'd called brother, the night before they buried him. Suddenly, this wasn't just a random woman in the desert. This was a message. And Ray knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the ghosts he'd spent years trying to outrun had finally found him. Ellie woke up to warmth. For a disoriented moment, she thought she must be dreaming, or maybe dead. A fire flickered nearby, casting dancing shadows on a stone and timber wall. She was lying beneath layers of thick fur and woven wool blankets. The air smelled of wood smoke, cedar, and something else. Something sharp and bitter, like medicinal herbs. Her hands still throbbed, but the pain had dulled to a deep, resonant ache. They'd been rewrapped in clean, tight bandages. Her mouth was a desert, and her lips cracked when she tried to wet them. She tried to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness sent her falling back into the furs. A shadow moved on the other side of the fire. A man. He was broad-shouldered, with long, dark hair tied back from a face that looked like it had been carved from the surrounding mountains. He was whittling a piece of wood, the knife in his hand moving with a slow, hypnotic grace. His eyes flicked up, met hers for a single, unreadable second, and then returned to his carving. They were dark, calm, and gave nothing away. She managed a dry cough, and his eyes lifted again. He stood, moved across the small room, and brought her a tin cup filled with water. She drank greedily, the cool liquid a blessing on her raw throat. It was the best thing she'd ever tasted. "Where am I?" she rasped, her voice a stranger to her own ears. "Safe," he said. Just the one word. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, but it wasn't unkind. "Who are you?" "Ray." She looked around the one-room cabin. It was a place built for solitude. Stone walls, heavy timber beams. A blacksmith's forge, cold and silent, stood in one corner. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters. Two long rifles leaned against the wall near the heavy plank door. This was not a place you stumbled upon by accident. This was a place you came to disappear. "Why?" she asked, her voice a little stronger now. "Why did you help me?" Ray stared into the fire, his hands still for the first time. He didn't look at her when he answered. "Because I recognize the brand on your hand." Ellie froze. The brand. It wasn't just random torture. It was a mark, a signature. And this stranger, this man who lived alone at the edge of the world, he knew what it was. Her hope of a simple rescue vanished, replaced by a new and terrifying thought. She hadn't escaped her past at all. She had just run right into the middle of someone else's. Sleep, when it finally came, brought fire and smoke. Ellie was back in the root cellar, the smell of damp earth and her own burning skin filling her lungs. Her Uncle Warren's voice, a greasy whisper in the dark, telling her to just make it easy on herself. The hiss of the iron, her own breath, trapped behind her teeth, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a scream. She woke up with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cabin was dark, save for the faint orange glow of the dying embers in the hearth. Ray was there, crouched by the fire, a silent sentinel in the gloom. He handed her a cloth soaked in something cool and bitter. She pressed it to her forehead, the strange herbal scent chasing away the lingering smell of smoke from her nightmare. "They wanted the land," she whispered into the darkness, the words tasting like ash. Ray simply nodded, his silhouette unmoving. "They said no one would believe me," she continued, the words tumbling out now, a confession to a stranger. "They said I was a thief, that I tried to swindle them. They'll tell the whole town. They won't stop looking." She met his eyes across the flickering embers. They were dark pools reflecting the fire, but showing nothing of the man behind them. So why save me? What is that brand? He didn't answer. He just added a small log to the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Outside, the wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, sounding like 100 mournful voices. By the next morning, she could sit up without the world spinning. Ray brought her a cup of hot, spiced broth that warmed her from the inside out. He didn't talk much, but he watched her. As he carefully changed the dressings on her hands, his touch was surprisingly gentle. The new salve he applied was dark and thick, smelling of pine tar and something else she couldn't name. "You'll keep most of the feeling," he said, his voice low. "The nerves aren't all dead. Will I be able to hold a gun?" The question was out before she could stop it. He looked up from his work, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was no surprise in them, no judgment, just a quiet assessment. "Yes," he said, "but not soon. I don't have much time." He didn't argue. He just finished tying the last bandage and went back to his own work, leaving her with the weight of his unspoken agreement. That evening, wrapped in a thick hide cloak, she stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched the sun bleed out across the horizon. The desert stretched out before her, a vast and broken emptiness of mesas and dusty brush. It should have felt terrifying. Instead, it felt like freedom. Ray stood near his forge, sharpening a long, wicked-looking blade on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. "Do you live out here alone?" she asked, breaking the silence. He nodded, not pausing his work. "Why?" He stopped. The blade rested in his hand, catching the last of the dying light. He looked out over the same empty vista she was watching. "Because I buried too many people to want to get to know anymore." The answer hung in the cold air between them. Inside, the fire burned low. The cabin smelled of sage and steel and secrets. Ellie knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that saving her hadn't been an act of kindness. It was an act of war. And she was standing in the home of a man who had been fighting for a very, very long time. Ellie's strength returned like a slow trickle of water in a dry creek bed. Each day, a little more. She started sweeping the cabin's stone floor, awkward and clumsy, using her forearms to push the broom. She tried to cook once, burning a pan of beans and cursing softly, which earned her the ghost of a smile from Ray. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to amusement on his face. He never pried. He never asked about the men who had branded her, or the land they wanted so badly. He moved like the wind over the rocks, present, but never pushing. He'd leave for hours at a time, returning with a rabbit for the pot, or a pouch of unfamiliar herbs, his silent eyes saying nothing of where he'd been or what he'd seen. One night, she watched him work at the forge, the roar of the fire filling the small cabin, the rhythmic clang of his hammer on steel a kind of violent music. He was shaping an old railroad spike into a new blade, his muscles moving with fluid power in the flickering firelight. Sparks danced in the darkness like angry stars. "Did you ever kill a man?" she asked, her voice quiet beneath the noise of the forge. He didn't answer right away. The hammer continued its steady rhythm. Clang, clang, clang. Then he stopped, plunging the glowing metal into a bucket of water. It hissed, a furious cloud of steam erupting into the air. "Yes," he said, his back still to her. "How many?" He turned then, the newly forged blade held loosely in his hand. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face. "Enough. Why did you stop?" "I didn't stop," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I just changed my reasons." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crept down Ellie's spine. She was beginning to understand. This man wasn't just a recluse. He was a weapon, waiting. A few nights later, she woke up from the same nightmare, heart pounding, the smell of the cellar thick in her throat. She stumbled out of the cabin, needing the cold night air to remind her she was free. The stars were a brilliant, merciless spray across the black sky. She stood barefoot in the dirt, letting the cold bite into her toes, grounding her. Ray followed a moment later, a blanket draped over his shoulder. He didn't speak, just held it out to her. She took it, wrapping it tightly around herself. "Do the nightmares ever go away?" she asked the darkness. No, he said, his voice coming from right beside her. But you get bigger. They stay the same size. She looked at his profile in the faint starlight, the hard line of his jaw, a pale, thin scar that ran from his temple down to his cheekbone, the immense weight his shoulders seemed to carry without any visible strain. You asked me why I saved you, he said, not looking at her. Because that brand, the snake eating itself, it's the mark of the Black Creek Company. The name meant nothing to her. The what? They're not prospectors. They're vultures. They find land with something valuable under it. Water, silver, it doesn't matter. And they take it. They offer a price. If you say no, they persuade you. If you still say no, he let the sentence hang in the air. My land is worthless, she said, shaking her head. It's just rock and dust. No land is worthless, Ray replied, his voice flat. You just don't know what you're sitting on yet. He finally turned to face her, and in the starlight, she saw the full weight of his past in his eyes. They killed my brother for a piece of land, not half as big as yours. They put the same mark on him before they threw his body in a ravine. He pulled up the sleeve of his left shirt, revealing a leather bracer on his forearm. He undid the straps, and even in the dim light, she could see it. A faded, puckered scar, identical in shape to the fresh, raw burns on her own hands. The snake eating itself. It was a warning, he said, his voice a low growl of ancient hatred. To me, a promise of what was to come if I didn't walk away. So I did. I came here to disappear. But they found you, which means sooner or later they're going to find me. The entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. This wasn't her fight anymore. It was their fight. She had stumbled into the one place on earth where her enemy was already known and already hated. And the man who had been running from them for years had just realized she'd led them right to his door. The revelation hung between them, heavier than a winter storm. The Black Creek Company. The name echoed in Ellie's mind, unlocking a dusty corner of her memory. She remembered her father years ago, sitting at the kitchen table late at night, his voice low and urgent as he spoke to her mother. He'd mentioned that name. He'd said they were like a plague, buying up land all over the territory, leaving ruin in their wake. He'd been afraid. Now she understood why. The next morning, Ray was different. The quiet solitude had been replaced by a tense, coiled energy. He returned from checking his trap lines with a look on his face that chilled Ellie more than the frost on his coat. Riders, he said, his voice clipped. 2 of them, on the East Ridge. Not local. They're not hunting deer. Are they looking for me? They're mapping the basin, he said, pulling one of the long rifles from the wall and beginning to clean it with methodical, angry movements. They think you're already dead. They're here to survey what they've stolen. Ellie's hands clenched into useless fists. A cold fury, purer and sharper than any pain she had felt, began to burn away her fear. What's on my land, Ray? What did my father find? Ray stopped cleaning the rifle and looked at her, a long, hard look. Your father was a geologist, wasn't he? She nodded, confused. Before he took up farming. How did you know that? Because men like him are the only ones who look at the ground and see what's beneath it, Ray said. He walked over to the stone hearth and pried a single loose stone from the wall beside it. Reaching into the dark cavity, he pulled out a rolled-up piece of oilskin. He spread it carefully on the small wooden table. It was a map, hand-drawn with charcoal and ink. It showed the entire basin, the ridges, the canyons, her own small 40-acre plot circled in red. But underneath the familiar topography was another drawing, a network of faint blue lines that all converged in a massive pool directly beneath her land. It's not silver, Ray said, his finger tracing one of the blue lines. It's water, an aquifer, a hidden river flowing underground. In this desert, Ellie, that's more valuable than gold. It's life. Control the water, and you control everything and everyone for 100 miles in every direction. It all clicked into place. The whispers, her father's fear, her uncle's sudden, vicious greed. It wasn't about 40 acres of dust. It was about an empire. They killed him, she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Her father's death, a fall from a horse, had been ruled an accident, but it wasn't. They murdered my father for this map, and they'll murder us for it too, Ray said, his voice grim. He began laying out weapons on the table. The 2 rifles, a small revolver, the long knife he always carried, a coil of rope. They'll be back, not scouts next time. They'll send a team to secure the location and eliminate any witnesses. That's how the Black Creek Company works. Ellie stared at the arsenal on the table. A week ago, she was a farmer's daughter. Now she was a target in a war she didn't even know was being fought. She looked at her bandaged hands, then at the revolver. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But something else was growing beside it. Rage. "Teach me," she said, her voice low but steady. "Teach me how to shoot." Ray looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw the fear, but he also saw the iron underneath it. He nodded slowly. "Get your coat. The lessons start now." He took her to a small, secluded canyon behind the cabin. He handed her the revolver. It was heavy, cold, and felt alien in her grasp. Her first few shots were wild, hitting nothing but rock and sky. Her grip was shaky, her arms weak. "You're fighting it," Ray said, his voice patient but firm. He adjusted her stance, moved her fingers on the grip. "Don't fight the gun. You're not its enemy. Tell it where to look. The gun is just a tool. You are the weapon." She took a deep breath, letting his words sink in. She raised the revolver again, this time with purpose. She wasn't just pointing a gun. She was aiming her rage. She squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon, and a chunk of bark flew from the dead stump they were using as a target. She hit it. A small, grim smile touched her lips. It was the first time she'd smiled in what felt like a lifetime. She looked at Ray, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. But their fragile moment of victory was shattered by a sound from the ridge above them. The unmistakable clatter of a dislodged stone. They both froze, spinning around, guns raised. A man stood on the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sun. He held a rifle, but it was pointed at the ground. He was young, barely a man, with a nervous look on his face. He was one of the men who had been with her uncle in the cellar, one of the men who had held her down. "Don't shoot!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to warn you." Ellie's finger tightened on the trigger. Ray put a hand on her arm. "Let him talk," he said, his own rifle still trained on the man's chest. "Warren's not in charge," the young man stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "He's just a puppet. The real boss, Silas Croft, he's coming himself. He knows you're alive. And he's not sending a team. He's sending an army." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "And there's something else. The deed they tried to make you sign, it wasn't just for your 40 acres. Read the fine print. It gives the Black Creek Company mineral and water rights to the entire basin. Your signature is the last one they need to make it all legal. You're not just a witness, lady. You're the key." The ground beneath Ellie's feet seemed to drop away. She wasn't just sitting on the water. She was the legal gatekeeper to all of it, and the most ruthless man in the territory was coming to take the key, one way or another. The young man's name was Jesse. He claimed he'd been forced into working for Warren, that his own family was in debt to the Black Creek Company. He looked terrified enough to be telling the truth. "Croft will be here by tomorrow night," Jesse said, scrambling down the rocks to join them in the canyon. "He thinks you're just one woman and some Apache squatter. He's not expecting a fight. He's expecting a slaughter." "Then we won't give him one," Ray said, his eyes scanning the surrounding ridges. He was thinking, planning, his mind working like a well-oiled machine. "We'll give him a war." They didn't have time. They didn't have numbers, but they had the land, and Ray knew its secrets. For the rest of that day and deep into the night, they worked. Ray, with a quiet, furious intensity, turned the entire approach to his cabin into a death trap. He dug pits filled with sharpened stakes along the narrow game trails, carefully concealing them with branches and dust. He set up tripwires connected to massive deadfalls of rock and timber. He wasn't just building defenses. He was weaponizing the mountain itself. Ellie, guided by Jesse's shaky descriptions of Croft's men, packed supplies, ammunition, water, dried meat, and the precious salves for her hands. Her fear had been replaced by a cold, clear focus. Every bullet she counted, every bandage she packed was an act of defiance. She was no longer the girl who ran. She was the woman who was digging in. "There's one more thing," she said to Ray, as they sat by the fire late that night. The silence of the cabin a stark contrast to the storm that was coming. "My father, he was scared of them, but he wasn't a coward. He must have had a plan. He kept a metal box hidden under a loose floorboard in the root cellar. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I needed to get that box to the federal marshal in Prescott." Ray looked up from sharpening his knife, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "The root cellar? The same place they held you?" She nodded, a shiver running down her spine despite the heat from the fire. "It's still there. I'm sure of it. Warren is a fool. He would never have looked for it. The proof we need to stop them, to expose them. It has to be in that box." A desperate, insane plan began to form in her mind. "They're coming here," she said, thinking aloud. "They think we're trapped, waiting. They won't be expecting us to leave." Ray's hands stilled. He understood immediately. "You want to go back there?" "They left their main force back at my homestead to guard the claim," Jesse chimed in, his voice barely a whisper. "Only Croft and about 10 of his best men are coming up here. The homestead is where their supplies are. It's their base." "We go there," Ellie said, her voice gaining strength. "While Croft is hunting us in these mountains, we go back to my home. We get that box, and we burn the rest of his operation to the ground." It was suicide, a frontal assault on an armed camp. But it was also the last thing on earth Silas Croft would ever expect. Ray looked from Ellie's determined face to Jesse's terrified one. He thought of his brother, of the years he'd spent hiding. The running was over. "All right," he said, the words cutting through the silence. "We go, but we're not just going to burn his camp. We're going to give the ghosts of this mountain something to feast on." They left before dawn, leaving the cabin empty, the fire in the hearth burning low. They left Ray's traps armed and waiting, a deadly welcome party for an uninvited guest. With Jesse guiding them through little-known ravines and canyons, they began the perilous journey back to the place where Ellie's nightmare had begun. She was no longer running from it. She was running toward it, with a gun in her hand and vengeance in her heart. The homestead looked like an armed encampment. Men with rifles patrolled the perimeter. Horses were tied up near the barn. A large tent, Croft's command post, had been set up in the yard where her mother's corn was supposed to grow. They watched from a rocky outcrop as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood. "Warren's in the house," Jesse whispered, pointing. "Croft left him in charge of the main force. He's too proud and too stupid to think you'd ever come back here." "That's what we're counting on," Ray said. He uncoiled a rope from his shoulder. "Ellie, you and I go for the cellar. Jesse, you're our distraction." Jesse's face went pale. "What kind of distraction?" "The loud kind," Ray said, handing him a small bundle of oil-soaked rags and a flint. "Set a fire in the barn. As soon as they run to fight it, we go in. We have 5 minutes, maybe less. Then we get out and we disappear." It was a plan held together by hope and desperation. Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. She looked at the house, at the root cellar doors. She thought of the pain, the humiliation. She wasn't going back into that darkness as a victim. She was going back as a reckoning. Jesse, shaking but resolute, scurried off towards the barn. Ellie and Ray crept closer to the house, hiding in the long shadows cast by the setting sun. Then they saw it. A flicker of orange from the direction of the barn, followed by a shout. Then another. Men started running, their figures dark against the growing blaze. The barn was going up in flames. It was their signal. "Now!" Ray hissed. They moved like lightning, sprinting across the open yard, their boots silent in the dust. They reached the slanted root cellar doors. Ray wrenched them open, revealing the black, gaping maw of the cellar. The smell of damp earth and old fear rushed out to greet them. "Go," Ray said, standing guard, his rifle sweeping the chaos in the yard. Ellie didn't hesitate. She plunged back into the darkness. Her personal hell. She moved by memory, her hands finding the loose floorboard near the back wall. She pried it up, and there it was. A small, heavy metal box. She grabbed it, her fingers closing around the cold steel. But as she turned to leave, her foot kicked something on the floor. Something that wasn't there before. It was a lantern, and it was lit. Standing in the far corner of the cellar, almost invisible in the shadows, was her Uncle Warren. He held a shotgun, and it was aimed directly at her chest. "I knew you'd come back for this, you little fool," he sneered, his face a twisted mask of greed and triumph. "Did you really think I didn't know every secret this worthless family ever had?" Above them, the shouting from the yard was getting closer. The fire had been a trick, and she had walked right into the trap. Warren's eyes gleamed in the lantern light, feral and triumphant. "Croft's not up on that mountain, Ellie. He's right here. The fire, the boy. It was all a show, to get you to come home." The pieces clicked together in Ellie's mind. Jesse, his convenient appearance, his story of fear and coercion. It was all a lie. He hadn't warned them. He'd led them into an ambush. From the top of the cellar stairs, a new voice echoed down, smooth and cold as a tombstone. "Well done, Warren. It seems your niece is as predictable as you said." A man appeared at the opening, silhouetted against the fiery glow of the burning barn. He was tall and impeccably dressed, a stark contrast to the grit and dust around him. This had to be Silas Croft. He held a pistol, and it was pointed down at Ray, who stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs. Jesse stood just behind Croft, a smug, hateful grin on his face. "The box, child," Croft said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of absolute menace. "Hand it over, and we can make this end quickly." Ellie's mind raced. They were trapped, outnumbered and outmaneuvered. But as she looked at the heavy metal box in her hands, she thought of her father. He hadn't been a fighter. He was a man of science, of paper and ink. He wouldn't have left her with just a map. He would have left her with a weapon. She glanced at Ray. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were on fire. He gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a nod of surrender. It was a nod of ignition. With a scream of pure rage, Ellie didn't hand the box over. She heaved it with all her might, not at Croft, but at the lantern sitting on the crate next to Warren. The lantern shattered. Oil and flame exploded outwards. Warren shrieked as his clothes caught fire, a human torch in the confined space. The shotgun blast went wide, tearing a hole in the ceiling as he fell. In that single, chaotic second, Ray moved. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a force of nature. He shoved Ellie behind him and launched himself up the stairs, straight into Croft's line of fire. Croft's pistol barked, once, twice. But Ray was like a phantom, twisting, using the narrow stairway for cover. He slammed into Jesse, sending the younger man tumbling back into the yard with a sickening crunch. Ellie scrambled up the stairs behind him, clutching the box. The yard was chaos. Men were running everywhere, caught between the burning barn and the sudden firefight at the cellar. Croft, his calm demeanor finally broken, was backing away, firing wildly towards the cellar opening. Ray grabbed Ellie's arm, pulling her out of the cellar and into the smoke-filled night. "The horses! Go!" he yelled over the roar of the fire and the crack of gunshots. They ran. Bullets whizzed past their heads, kicking up dirt at their feet. They were exposed, 100 yards of open ground between them and the tethered horses. They were never going to make it. And then, from the darkness at the edge of the homestead, all hell broke loose. A volley of rifle fire erupted from the rocky outcrops surrounding the farm. Not one or two shots, but a dozen. Croft's men cried out, spinning and falling, caught completely by surprise. They were being attacked from all sides. Croft spun around, his face a mask of disbelief, searching for the source of the attack. Pinned down, he and his remaining men took cover behind a water trough. Ellie and Ray flattened themselves in the dirt, caught in the crossfire. Ellie looked at Ray, her eyes wide with confusion. "Who is that?" A grim smile touched Ray's lips. It was the first true smile she had ever seen from him. "I told you I buried too many people," he said, his voice a low growl of satisfaction. "I never said they were all my friends." From the rocks, a figure rose, shouting a war cry that seemed to shake the very ground. He was an old Apache warrior, his face a roadmap of scars and wrinkles, and he held a rifle as if it were a part of his own arm. And behind him more figures rose, the silent, forgotten people of the basin. The other families the Black Creek Company had tried to erase. Ray hadn't just been hiding on that mountain. He had been waiting. And he hadn't been waiting alone. Silas Croft had walked into a trap of his own making. He thought he was cornering two desperate fugitives. He had no idea he was stepping into the heart of an uprising. The battle for the basin had begun. The homestead became a maelstrom of fire and shadow. Ray's allies, the families he'd quietly watched over for years, moved with the deadly efficiency of ghosts. They used the terrain, the darkness, and Croft's own arrogance against him. They were farmers and ranchers, men and women who had been pushed to the brink and had finally decided to push back. Ray pulled Ellie behind the relative safety of a stone well. "Get that box open," he yelled, laying down covering fire with his rifle. Ellie's hands, still stiff and scarred, fumbled with the latch. It was locked. Cursing, she slammed it against the stone wall of the well, again and again, until the rusted hinge finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal. She threw the lid open. Inside, it wasn't just maps. It was her father's entire life's work, his detailed geological surveys, his journals, filled with dated entries describing Silas Croft's threats and intimidation tactics. And tucked at the very bottom, a bundle of letters. They were copies of his correspondence with a U.S. Marshal named Elias Vance, detailing everything, pleading for a federal investigation. But there was one more thing, a single folded sheet of paper, separate from the rest. She unfolded it. It wasn't a map or a letter. It was a legal document, an official deed, stamped and signed by the territorial governor, dated 30 years prior. It granted sole ownership and guardianship of the Whispering River Aquifer and the surrounding sacred lands, not to her grandfather, but to the Apache tribe of the basin, recognizing their ancestral claim. Her family had never legally owned the land. They were its stewards. Her grandfather and then her father had been tasked with protecting it, holding the paper title as a shield against men like Croft until the tribe's own legal standing could be solidified. That's why her signature was so important. The deed they tried to make her sign wasn't just a transfer of her 40 acres. It was a fraudulent document that would have used her stewardship to extinguish the tribe's ancestral rights forever. She wasn't just fighting for her home. She was fighting for theirs, too. A bullet ricocheted off the stone well, inches from her head, snapping her back to reality. The firefight was intensifying. Croft's men were professionals, and despite the surprise attack, they were starting to rally. "Ray!" she shouted, holding up the old deed. "Look!" He glanced at it, his eyes widening in comprehension as he saw the governor's seal and the names of the tribal elders listed as the true grantees. A look of fierce, terrible joy crossed his face. "The mountain remembers," he whispered. Just then, Silas Croft made his move. Using the chaos as cover, he and his last few men made a break for the remaining horses. He was abandoning his men, trying to save himself. "He's getting away," Ellie cried. "No, he's not," Ray said. He let out a sharp, piercing whistle. From the burning barn, a massive shape detached itself from the shadows. It was Croft's own prize stallion, but someone had cut it loose. And it wasn't running away. It was running towards the fight, spooked and wild-eyed. It galloped directly into the path of Croft and his men, scattering them like bowling pins. Croft was thrown to the ground, his pistol flying from his hand. He looked up, his face bloody and smeared with dirt, just as Ray loomed over him, the long, newly forged knife gleaming in the firelight. But before Ray could act, Ellie was there, standing between them. She held her father's journal in her hand. "No," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "Not like this. Not his way." She looked down at the terrified Silas Croft. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't a survivor. She was her father's daughter, and his justice would be served not with a blade, but with the truth. She tossed the journal onto Croft's chest. "You're not going to die tonight," she said, her voice as cold as the desert stars. "You're going to prison, and you're going to read every word my father wrote about you while you rot." As if on cue, a new sound cut through the night. Hoofbeats, a lot of them. A posse of riders crested the nearby hill, their badges glinting in the firelight. At their head was a stern-looking man with a thick mustache and a U.S. Marshal's star pinned to his chest. "Silas Croft," the marshal boomed, his voice carrying over the dying sounds of the battle. "You're under arrest. It seems your mail has finally been delivered." Marshal Vance had finally received her father's last letter. Croft just stared, his empire of greed and fear crumbling to ash around him. It was over. In the aftermath, the homestead was a scene of quiet, exhausted victory. Croft and his men, including the treacherous Jesse and a badly burned but still living Warren, were taken away in chains by Marshal Vance's posse. The old Apache warrior, whose name was Chado and was Ray's uncle, clasped Ray's shoulder in a silent, powerful gesture of reunion. The other families of the basin gathered, their faces weary but filled with a hope they hadn't known in years. Marshal Vance walked over to Ellie, who stood holding the metal box, the true deed clutched in her hand. "Your father was a good man, Miss Thompson," the marshal said, his voice softer now. "He wrote to me for months. We were building a case, but we could never get the final proof we needed. This," he gestured to the box, "this changes everything. The Black Creek Company is finished." He looked at the deed in her hand, then at Ray and Shadow standing nearby. "And it looks like this land is finally back where it belongs." In the weeks that followed, the world shifted. The true deed was honored. The aquifer was placed under the protection of the tribe, ensuring it would be shared by all the people of the basin, not exploited by one. Ellie's 40 acres remained hers, but she was no longer just its owner. She was its guardian, a partner with the people who had fought alongside her. She didn't go back to the town. Her home was no longer the small farmhouse, with its ghosts of pain and betrayal. Her home was the mountain. She and Ray rebuilt his cabin, making it stronger, adding a new room with a window that faced the sunrise. They didn't speak of love or of the future. They didn't need to. Their bond had been forged in fire and sealed in blood. It was something deeper, quieter, and more unbreakable than any simple romance. They had found each other not by chance, but by shared purpose. One evening, months later, they sat on a bench Ray had built, watching the sunset paint the desert in brilliant colors. The land was quiet, peaceful. The scars on Ellie's hands had faded to pale, silvery lines. They no longer ached. They were just a reminder of the woman she had become. She was no longer the girl who ran. She was the storm that had come to the desert and washed it clean. And in the quiet that followed, she had finally found her peace. Thank you so much for sticking with Ellie's story all the way to the end. If you found yourself rooting for her and Ray, and you want to hear more stories about justice, survival, and the strength of the human spirit, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, leave a comment telling me what you thought, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really does help keep these stories coming. We'll see you in the next one.